I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio, where we tell stories about the surprising ways that sewing impacts our lives. Everybody, welcome to episode number 38 of Seamwork Radio. Today we're going to be talking about how to recognize high quality in clothing and how to bring those details into your sewing. So we're going to cover the 3 areas to look for when it comes to quality, why a lot of what you read on the internet about clothing quality is wrong or maybe just a little bit off, and how we personally define high quality. So yeah, that's what we'll be talking about today. I'm excited to talk about this subject because I have been thinking about cleaning out my closet and thinking about the varying levels of quality in some of the clothing I own. So I think this will help me to kind of make some decisions about what I have and what I need to get rid of.
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's like a lot of confusion about what makes clothing really good quality and what exactly that means. And probably the reason for that is that fast fashion has really changed the standards of clothing and left people really just confused. There's also a lot of misinformation out there for the non-sewing audience. I think that as sewers, we adopt a lot more knowledge on this subject, but even as someone with sewing knowledge, it can be like a little bit opaque.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the information that's out there on the internet that's written for a more general audience is just, well, it's not all necessarily incorrect, but some of it is a little bit more broad than if you know a little bit more about clothing and how it's constructed, then it doesn't necessarily always make sense.
Yeah, and there's so many situations with clothing, depending on the type of garment, the fabric, that there's all of these caveats, and it's a situation where being broad isn't necessarily really helpful.
Yeah, totally. Like, I don't know, getting back to the kind of the bigger question, like how do you personally define high quality? What does high quality mean to you, Haley?
I mean, to me, high quality is finishes and fabrics that are appropriate for the garment. Those kinds of things show me that the person who designed and crafted that article of clothing knew what they were doing. I want to see like some intentional construction in details and of course high quality fabrics and all of that. But I just want to know that I want to be able to look at it and know, yes, this person made intentional choices, not just the choice that was the cheapest for the manufacturer.
Yeah, I like that you use the word intentional. I think that has a lot to do with it. When it comes to recognizing quality, I feel like it's looking for that intention of making something that is going to last. So for me, I think a lot of quality comes down to just, is this something that's built to last? Is it something that's meant to stick around for a long time and be usable for a long time and really comfortable to wear and fit all the criteria that you need for the duration?
Yeah.
So I feel like when it comes to recognizing quality, there are certain things you look for, but do you feel like there are rules that clothing has to follow in order to be high quality?
It's a good question. I think this is really going to vary from garment to garment. So for instance, if I was shopping for a high quality blazer, I would look for different things than if I was shopping for a high quality slip dress. And, a slip dress, really delicate fabric or even some transparency, those would all be like appropriate things that were made sense for that type of garment. But if I was looking for a blazer and I noticed that the fabric was very loosely woven and I could see shoulder pads peeking out from under the fabric, then that would be a no-go for me. Obviously, that's a really extreme case. But I think just knowing a little bit more about that garment type that you're shopping for, and I think this is a good thing because it kind of forces you to be an intentional purchaser as well. If you know you want to add a blazer to your wardrobe, taking some time and thinking about the things that make it quality. And if you don't know, researching it a little bit, because it's going to vary so much from garment to garment.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the appropriateness to the actual piece that you're trying to make or that you're trying to buy. Because one of the things that I saw when I was doing some research for this podcast was I saw one article, I feel like it was on like Business Insider or something, like, I don't know, some general audience website. And it said that sheer fabrics are low quality and don't buy sheer fabrics. And I thought, what a strange thing to say. Like, obviously there are high quality sheer fabrics. There's silk georgette and, there's all kinds of beautiful sheer fabric chiffons that are not necessarily low quality, but I think what they meant is just that they won't last as long as something that's more opaque, like if you're buying a shirt or something, which, that might be true. It is more delicate and requires different care, but it's also what's appropriate to the garment and what the look is supposed to be, and, the intention of the garment, not just this is kind of what I meant when I said these overgeneralized rules,
Yeah, definitely. In theory, if you buy a gorgeous like silk organza dress, you probably won't be wearing it and
going through it so fast.
Putting as much heavy use on it as you would a pair of jeans. So that would be an appropriate use of fabric.
Yeah, I wouldn't buy sheer jeans.
Maybe not, unless you're making like a statement. I can see some designer I know I've seen that on the runway. I know I have.
I'm sure there are sheer jeans out there. And not just ones with holes.
Yeah, well, you know how the whole like Gen Z thing right now with hating on the millennial and like skinny jeans. Not that just millennials wear skinny jeans, but they're walking around the mall going to Claire's in their sheer jeans.
I don't really get these generational rivalries.
I know.
But I'm Gen X, so nobody ever talks about us.
Yeah. Lucky.
Low key.
So low key. I'm like right dead in the middle of millennial. So half of my friends are like Gen X and the other half are millennial, and the rivalry is great. That's a whole other episode we could talk about.
Mm-hmm. You get the best of both worlds though.
Yeah.
When you're thrift store shopping, when you're looking through I say thrift store just because there's a wide variety of clothing in a thrift store, and that's a place where you would expect to find a lot of varying levels of quality. So let's say if you're at a thrift store, what kind of stuff do you look for when you're shopping?
Okay. So I have a very specific strategy when I go to thrift stores. I like to go I always have like a running list of things in mind that are like on my docket. So I don't end up buying like a million things that I don't need, even though it's cheaper and more eco-friendly. I don't want to consume mindlessly. So I have my like top 3 sections I want to hit. Let's say like coats and jackets, and I want to look at handbags, and then I want to look at like bedside tables, whatever. I love getting the furniture there too. I always do a first pass just touching the fabric. It sounds kind of gross in like a COVID world, but I, to be frank, I haven't thrift store shopped in over a year, but I usually do a first pass just touching the fabric, because as someone who has a lot of experience with textiles and fabric, that can be one of the first indicators of quality to me. When I feel wool, then, I want to take a little closer look. And then once I do my first pass, which I'm also kind of looking at color just because of preference, then I'll go through, and if I don't find what I'm looking for right then, I'll dig a little bit deeper. But fabric is probably the first indicator to me that it's appropriate, high quality, and what I want.
Yeah. I think for me too, I also haven't been thrift shopping in at least a year, and oh God, I really miss it. I really miss going. But I've been shopping at thrift stores since I was really young, and I feel like with the fabric, it's both a feel thing, and you start to visually recognize things like silk when you're looking at blouses, or wool when you're looking at blazers, or I think it's a kind of a combination of those two things. But I think that's a good point, is the fabric is kind of the first thing you notice.
It's also, it can be an indicator of quality for sure, but also just there's so much preference about fiber and fabric that it's also just a good indicator of, quality aside, if it's going to sit in your closet and you're never going to wear it, then, was it even worth it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think personal preference is a big part of it too.
Mm-hmm.
I personally love things like silk. And so that's something that I gravitate more towards when I'm at a thrift store.
Definitely.
Cool. Well, you want to share some tips? We have got some other things that we were thinking about when it comes to looking for quality. Maybe we can kind of talk through those a little bit.
Yeah. So we're going to run you through our top kind of 3 things to look out for. The first thing to keep an eye out for is seams. What you're looking for here is that the seam finishes and the stitching are important and that they're appropriate for the type of garment. I think this is a place where there's also a lot of misinformation. When we were doing research, we found someone saying that, oh, you want to look for really, really close, tight stitches, which is like, no, not necessarily. If you're looking at denim, you're looking at the top stitching on it. It would be totally inappropriate if you were looking at these teeny tiny stitches, as opposed to a silk blouse where smaller stitches, of course, are more appropriate. In addition to the stitching, stitch length, like finishes in general, is if you're looking for a jacket, is it lined? That's going to affect the longevity of that particular jacket. If it's a silk blouse, are they using French seams? Are they just passing it through a serger? All of these are indicators of how intentionally this garment was constructed and that the manufacturers were making choices to create quality over something that was going to give them, a better profit margin because it was cheaper to produce.
Yeah, it's hard to find like a silk blouse that has French seams, for example. That's something that you don't come across very often. Mm-hmm. I feel like if I found that in the thrift store, I'd be pretty thrilled.
Yeah, that's an extreme example, but yeah, if you find it.
That's like a great thing about sewing, though, is that you can incorporate those really high quality seam finishes into everything you make. You can make sure that you're choosing the seam finish that's going to be the most elegant and that's going to really make the garment last the longest. And when it comes to something like French seams, it's going to be inconspicuous and it's just going to look really good. So you can make that choice.
I mean, in fast fashion, I have so many pet peeves, but one of them is when I see a sheer garment that has serged finishes. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
The seam lines on a sheer garment can be just such a gorgeous, like kind of textural detail. And then you go and you ruin it with this clunky, loopy, serged edge. That's just my personal pet peeve. The next thing, seams aside, we're going to look for is materials. And I'm not just talking about fabric here. We're also looking at notions such as buttons and zippers. Are they using real shell buttons or wood buttons? Is the zipper metal? And also, not that a synthetic zipper is inappropriate, but for a pair of trousers, a metal zipper is going to have a little bit more longevity to it. Mm-hmm. Also, many high quality garments are going to feature natural fibers. But it's important to also recognize the cases where that's not necessarily true. Things like activewear, obviously, you're going to want to look for something that's more moisture wicking, and a synthetic would be totally appropriate for that type of garment. I think this is another example, which I think we're touching on a lot, is that you have to kind of know the rules to break them. So natural fibers are definitely preferable, but only where appropriate.
Yeah. And sometimes they're blended, like there'll be a little bit of poly in something just to help with controlling wrinkles or something like that. Mm-hmm. So that's just something you can be aware of. I prefer natural fibers generally, but sometimes a little synthetic is a good thing.
Yeah, and I think most people prefer natural fibers, and that's because I think that they generally enhance the fabric's look and feel. They make them more breathable. Oftentimes, natural fibers are going to drape a little bit better. They're going to not have like a weird kind of synthetic sheen to them. And all of those factors kind of contribute to a more expensive high-end looking garment.
Yeah.
One more thing to look out for is fabric recovery. This is especially important when you're looking at knitwear and can also be important with some wovens, but you want to make sure that give that fabric a little stretch. Does it bounce back? That often can indicate to you that the fabric is a little bit better quality, of course, where appropriate. I have like a really fantastic Eileen Fisher top that doesn't have great recovery, but it's also really drapey and kind of oversized. So it doesn't need that great recovery. So knowing like, is this form fitting? If so, does it have good recovery? Those kinds of things are what you're looking out for.
What I like to do with fabrics, either when I'm buying a knit fabric or if I'm, thinking about buying something that's made of a knit fabric, is just kind of, if you poke it, does the fabric recover? Does the little dimple from poking it stay there, or does it blend back into the fabric? And that's a good way to look for how well it recovers. And then of course you can stretch it and just see, does it whip back into shape or does it stay stretched out?
Yeah, definitely. Fabric recovery is so important. I mean, I talk about this all the time in all the fabric videos that we do on our YouTube channel, is that if you're counting on that mechanical stretch of the fabric for fitting over your form, then you definitely want to look for that really great recovery.
Yeah.
And last but not least, you're going to want to look out for construction. One really great indicator, if you're buying something that has a print to it, is do the plaid, the floral, the stripe, did they make an effort to match it all up? This is huge. And I see this so often in ready to wear, completely overlooked. And I think to most sewists, it's like such a glaring no.
Yeah. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's one of those things.
For me, one of the worst is when it's a pair of pants and they don't match up the crotch seam.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Because then I'm just staring at your crotch. And I don't care like who you are. Like I really don't want to stare at your crotch. And I'm sure you don't want me to be staring at your crotch. It just like, it's unattractive in most places, but the crotch is, oh my gosh, don't do it.
Yeah, it really draws the eye. It's like something's wrong here. Yeah, I think there are times where, you can intentionally not match your stripes or your plaids. Like I sometimes like to, if you're doing like the back yoke of a shirt or something, that can be cut on the bias. So it looks really cool that way. Or, there are other ways you can intentionally not match them. But I think, you can tell when it's an intentional mismatch usually, or if it's just done for the sake of economy.
When I was in design school, my first semester garment construction class, we had to make a plaid shirt, like draft and sew a plaid shirt. And one of the requirements was that the plaid had to match. And unless you were intentionally not matching it, like a yoke on the bias or something. And people took that to the extreme. There's like these like every other piece bias cut so they didn't have to match like hardly anything. Like seriously.
It is a lot of work, and it's kind of like, it's a little bit of a rabbit hole, because once you start trying to match it, you can get really crazy with it. You can really get really very, very, very particular. Is it, a quarter of a millimeter off? It's going to drive me nuts, that kind of thing.
And I have this like very vivid memory of like ripping the sleeve out on this shirt like 8 times, and I stabbed myself with the seam ripper.
Oh God.
So horribly. It was my first like really good sewing related injury. We've gone down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but matching prints definitely an indicator of a quality garment.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that can be a really kind of sneaky indicator of quality garments is, does the garment have a bit of weight to it? Of course, this is where appropriate, like outerwear or suits, in certain cases, maybe even a dress or a gown. Oftentimes, really high quality garments are going to have a lot of kind of infrastructure to the garment that you cannot see. And that weight is an indicator of that maybe the chest of the jacket is padded out in a very traditional way. So weight can be a really good indicator of that.
Yeah.
Another construction thing to look out for is hand sewn details. In a garment manufacturing world, everything is designed in most cases to be made quick. And hand sewing is not quick. If you can see that the manufacturer took the time for there to be a little hand sewn detail, that is a really good indicator that that was a quality garment, and is probably an expensive garment as well.
Yeah. I don't have very many garments that have hand sewn details that I haven't made myself. I do have one that I got it like, oh gosh, probably 15 years ago, this Marc Jacobs dress that I found in a shop, and it had a hand sewn hem. And that was probably the first garment I ever bought that had a hand sewn detail on it. And I just thought it was so luxurious.
It is. I mean, human hands touch everything that we buy, but knowing that someone sat there and hand sewed that hem is pretty major. I've only had vintage garments with hand sewn details, never a modern one.
Yeah. Yeah. It used to be a lot more common.
Yeah, definitely. Even the tags on lots of vintage garments you'll see are hand sewn on.
Yeah.
And then the last kind of construction thing to look out for is classic traditional construction. Of course, this has some kind of exceptions. Something Sarah and I were talking about was top stitching on anything that has a notch collar. This is, I guess we're going to talk about my sewing pet peeves. One of my sewing pet peeves is that when something has a notch collar and they don't top stitch it the correct way, traditionally, you're supposed to stitch around the collar, and then you kind of do like a triple pivot at the notch so that you're creating two 90-degree angles. And when I see that they just pivot and then continue sewing on the lapel, I'm like, oh my gosh. Again, it's a place where they're cutting corners because it costs more money to have someone sit there on the machine and pivot their needle 3 times. This is just one example. Sarah, can you think of other examples of traditional construction to look out for?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about shirts and you know, more traditional garments like that. So you mentioned jackets and blazers. And I think with shirts, there are a lot of really traditional details that you can look for, you know, like the placket on the cuff. Is it, you know, the traditional placket, that sort of thing. But of course it's all about style. So some things are not going to have a traditional look to them and they're not going to have those traditional details. But if you're trying to buy something that's really classic and it's going to have that very classic tailored look, then I think knowing what those details are, what those classic details are, can really help. And I think if you buy books on making those certain types of garments, for example, David Page Coffin's book on shirt making is really, really wonderful.
So good.
And will teach you all about those traditional details. So if you want to get into shirt making, it's great. But also if you just want to know about what makes a great shirt, that's a really wonderful resource. You know, there are specialty sewing books on all kinds of garments. So I think that's a really cool thing about sewing, is that you really learn about those tiny little details of clothing.
Definitely. I think that what I take away from all of this is that it's so varied and so dependent on the type of garment that really it's important to know the caveats for each type of garment, which really encourages a more intentional kind of buying practice, and not just like buying a shirt because you see it and you want it.
Yeah. just understanding what goes into a garment and why those rules exist, and then why somebody might ignore them. It could be because of style reasons. It could just be, they wanted a different look, but it also can be just for the sake of economy and cutting corners in order to make a cheaper garment. And so if you know why those rules exist and you know what they are, you can make that decision for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, let me just recap real quick what we talked about. So we talked about really 3 ways that you can look for quality in a garment, or that you can build quality into the garments that you're making. So those 3 things are the seams, the materials, and the construction techniques. So for the seams, you want to look for the right seam finishes and the right kind of stitching, depending on the garment and the fabric. And you want to look and see if it has any seam finishes that are not serged. Not that there's anything wrong with serging, and serging is definitely appropriate for a lot of garments, but something that has an alternative seam finish would probably took more time. And if that's something that you want to build into your own clothing, then looking into different seam finishes and where to use what seam finish can be a really great way to add that kind of hidden layer of quality to your clothing. And then when it comes to materials, look for high quality notions like buttons and zippers. Think about the fibers, whether it's a natural fiber or not, and is it used appropriately in that way. And then just the kind of look and feel of the fabric. Is it breathable? Does it drape well? Does it look good? If it's a stretchy fabric, does it have good recovery? So just do a little bit of a stretch test. So that's the materials. And then for the construction, you want to look for things like matching prints, especially with plaids and stripes. That's a really good indication that they took the time with the garment, and it's something that you can learn to do too when you're sewing, is how to match plaids and stripes with your sewing. And then if it's a garment that it's appropriate with, does it have the right kind of internal weight to it? Does it have the right kind of interfacing and padding and that kind of thing if it's suiting? So does it have that sort of heftiness to it that comes from having all those details inside? And whether it has hand sewn details is another thing to look for. And it's another thing that you can add to your own garments. And then just knowing kind of about classic traditional construction for those classic traditional garments. And that's a great way to learn, both in terms of sewing and then in terms of clothing that you do buy, just kind of learning the techniques, the specialty techniques for different kinds of garments like shirt making. We'll put a link to that David Page Coffin book if you're interested in learning about shirts specifically, because I just love that book. I think it's such a wonderful sewing book. All right. Wow, we went through a lot today in this episode.
We did.
Well, I hope it's helped people to think about quality just in terms of, not just buying and making sure that you can acquire clothes that last a long time, but also, it can be really fun, I think, to learn about quality and how you can build it into your sewing, because I think it just makes you feel so much more pride in what you're making if you know that you really took the time to make something that you're going to love for a really long time.
Definitely. I think there's a point that most of us reach in our sewing journeys where we're less interested in being super prolific and more interested in creating those really high quality garments that you'll wear for a long time and that might be out of reach for you to buy ready to wear.
Yeah. And I think this pandemic has also really enhanced that for a lot of people, because I think this is probably true for most people, just not wearing the same variety of clothing that we normally do. So for me, I just haven't felt the need to have a lot more clothing, but I do want the things that I have to be high quality, and I do want them to be comfortable and just to have things that will remain with me for a long time and that I can just love. All right. So I think we'll wrap it up here because this is kind of a little bit of a long one, but I wanted to ask you guys that if you like this episode, please leave us a review and let us know. We would really appreciate it. We're having a giveaway for reviews all through this month, May 2021. So if you leave us a review, we'll put a link in the show notes and you can just let us know there at that link. So first step is to leave a review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on right now, whether that's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. If you could just leave us a review. And then the second step is to visit the URL that we're going to put in the show notes and let us know that you did. And if you do, you could win a year of Seamwork membership. That's unlimited Seamwork membership for a year. So that's $180 value. So we'll put that link in the show notes, but we would really, really super appreciate a review from you guys. It really lets us know that you're enjoying the show and that you want more from us. And it also helps other people to find the show. So we super, super appreciate it. All right. So that's it for us this week. I hope you guys have a great week and we will talk to you next week.
See ya.
Bye, guys.
Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the Seamwork community, and you can find us at seamwork.com. If you have a story to share, send us an email at podcast@seamwork.com. We'd especially love to hear stories from those whose experiences often get left out of the conversation, whether because of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, age, or any other reason. Again, that's podcast@seamwork.com. You can find us on Instagram at Seamwork and Seamwork Video on YouTube. We'd love to invite you to join us at seamwork.com. We have an amazing community there, as well as new sewing patterns and classes each month for members. Podcast listeners can get 50% off our unlimited membership, which gets you unlimited downloads from our library of over 150 wardrobe-building sewing patterns. Just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find that link in the show notes. And if you like this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or the podcast app of your choice. It really helps other people to find the show so they can hear these stories too. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back with you soon. I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio.